time. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to our bullying, how to identify it and what to do about it. We are going to get started in just a minute. In the meantime, let me introduce myself. My name is Liliana Diaz-Pedrosa. I am the director of the Parent Center at Advocates for Children, and I will be in the Q&A. Today's presentation will be by Dawn Euster, who is our director of the School Justice Project. Say hello, Dawn.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
And while we wait, I'm going to launch a couple of polls just to see who's here, and so that we can get acquainted. Two things that you should know about today's presentation. If you need transcription should be up and you should be able to look at what we're saying in the caption. You can activate that if you wish. You will get an emailed version of this presentation later. So you don't need to take screenshots. We promise we will send this to you. There will be a poll at the end of the presentation that asks you for your email address so that you can share it with us, and that will guarantee, if you didn't register through Eventbrite, that we have an email where to send this information. We will be taking questions through the Q&A feature. Chat is not available through this presentation today. So if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A. If we have time at the end and when we stop the presentation and the recording, we may be able to take a couple of more complex questions, but for the time being, please use the Q&A. For now, let's see who's here. We see that there are quite a number of parents and a lot of educators, so welcome all. And a lot of you are coming in from all over the city. That's great. Sometimes we don't see people from Staten Island, so I'm really excited to see Staten Island. Welcome. We love having you here. Although, as usual, Manhattan is leading the race as to who is here now. And let's see. I think I'm gonna fade it into the background. And I'm gonna give another launch for that poll because there's more people coming in. So let us know who's here. And I'm going to fade to black, and I'll see you guys in the Q&A. Bye.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Again, my name is Dawn Euster. I'm the director of the School Justice Project. I am very happy to be here with you. We are going to talk about bullying, how to identify it, and what to do about it. And there's a lot of materials. We are going to get started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Advocates for Children. Who is Advocates for Children? What is Advocates for Children? And so we can move to the next slide. And Advocates for Children is an independent agency that protects the education rights of all New York City students. We have a helpline. The number is on the slide, 866-427-6033, and we're open Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. to take questions from anyone in the city or around the state about issues related to education. And we focus our services on New York City students in terms of providing certain number of free legal services to low-income families. And we also have lots of workshops and trainings, as this one is here, and a ton of guides and resources on our website. We were founded in 1971 by parents of students with disabilities, but the mission has expanded over the years, and we have several projects in our organization, including early childhood education, charter schools. We have a project that focuses on students who are homeless, immigrant students, and English language learners. A school justice project that I oversee, where we focus on helping students who are facing school discipline, bullying, or engaging in bullying, court-involved youth, and we work to end the school-to-prison pipeline. We also help students who are involved in the child welfare system, overage, older students, and really any students who are being discriminated against, or really need academic support, behavioral support. So we can move to the next slide and focus on the agenda for today. So introductions, which we just did, and then we're going to move into what is bullying? How are students protected from bullying? How is bullying reported? How is it investigated? How is bullying determined? How should schools respond to bullying? Transfers to another school? And what are the rights of students with disabilities? In addition, we're going to talk about social emotional supports for both students who are engaging in bullying, as well as supports for students who are the target of bullying. And we're going to give some more resources. So on the next slide, here we go, we're going to go into what is bullying. So the key here is that everyone who is watching this training webinar has likely witnessed bullying. You may have experienced it all different periods in life, including in school, outside of school. You may have been the target of bullying. You might have engaged in bullying behavior or intimidated another person. So we all have personal experiences, and there are lots of different definitions that we use for the word bullying. What we're going to talk about today is the legal definition of bullying in New York City public schools, and what New York City public schools need to do to protect students, what they're required to do under the law and New York City policy. Just to note that I will not be covering charter schools. We do have a guide if you have questions about specific rules related to charter schools. But this presentation is really focusing on students going to schools with New York City, within the New York City Department of Education. That said, when I talk about state law related to bullying, that does apply to all public schools, and charter schools are public schools. So the definition that we're talking about here comes from state law, which is a law called Dignity for All Students Act. We're also talking in New York City about chancellor's regulations the Department of Education has. And bullying can take a lot of different forms. It can be spoken, it can be physical, it can be electronic. You know, you can witness bullying, you can experience bullying, there are a lot of different forms that it can take. And the key is with the definition, the legal definition, is that in order for it to be bullying, it must impact a student's well-being at school. And it doesn't mean that the bullying has to happen in school, but it has to have an impact at school. And on top of that, it must create what is called a hostile environment, which the state defines as something that is substantially interfering with student learning, substantially interfering with students' mental, emotional, and or physical well-being, reasonably cause fear for safety, or reasonably expected to cause physical injury or emotional harm. So it's really 4 different categories of potential harm. And so the key thing to note is that it's reasonably expected. So it doesn't actually have to cause injury or harm, but it has to be reasonably expected to cause injury or emotional harm or cause fear for safety. So even if a student says that they are not scared or harm didn't occur, it could still be considered to create a hostile environment and be defined as bullying under the law. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about now, I think it's actually one slide, there we go, what kinds of behavior may be forms of bullying. And so it could be physical, and but it doesn't have to be physical. And the examples on this slide are just examples. So keep in mind that these are all examples: physical violence, stalking, threats, taunts, teasing, aggressive or menacing gestures, derogatory language, name calling or slurs. Could be a racial slur, ethnic slur, exclusion from peer groups designed to humiliate or isolate. The bullying, so it's important to note that when we're talking about bullying, we're talking about behavior. And oftentimes students play what we would call a fluid role when it comes to bullying. So where in one incident, they may be a target of bullying, and then in another incident, they may be the aggressor or vice versa. And so that is one reason why it's really important not to talk about students as bullies, but talk about the behavior, talk about them either being targeted or engaging in bullying or being bullied, talk about what is actually happening, and really, and not labeling, not, because also students can change, the behavior can change. Students can learn different behavior, but when you start to label a student as a bully, that becomes their identity. And that is hard to change too. And it can be very stigmatizing, and it can further isolate, and it is not a helpful situation. So the other distinction that I want to make is between bullying and conflict. So not all issues between two people are considered bullying. So there could be conflict, there could be a fight that is not bullying. And how do you distinguish? Some of the hallmarks of bullying are intimidation, repeated behavior happening over and over again, shaming for some aspect of identity, excluding a student based on an aspect of their identity. So it's important to note that not all the behavior listed on the slide is always bullying. There may be exceptions. And again, there are behaviors not on the slide that can be bullying. So you really need to go back to the definition of bullying and determine if the behavior has the elements of creating a hostile environment for the student before using the word bullying to describe it. And so now we're going to turn to talking about cyberbullying. And anything that meets the definition of bullying that we talked about can be considered bullying, and a student can be disciplined for bullying in school, and we'll get to that, and also supported in the school. Cyberbullying is one example of bullying. And what is cyberbullying? It is written or graphic material, including graffiti, photographs, drawings, or videos, containing comments or stereotypes that are electronically circulated, or are written or printed. So it could be something that's electronic that then becomes printed out. Snapchat, Facebook, YouTube, Zoom chat, Google Classroom, any of these are just examples. Any of these types of electronics are considered cyber communications. How does it become bullying? Again, it goes back to that definition. It's just that it's happening in a electronic form and circulated in a social media form potentially. And the key also here is for there to be for it to count as under the legal definition of bullying in New York State in schools for students, there must be a connection between the cyberbullying and school. So it must happen, for example, between members of the same school community, or maybe reference something that might happen in schools. So there has to be that connection. So for example, if a student was, let's say, threatening a neighbor, who is not a student, that would not be something that would be cyberbullying for purposes of the legal definition for schools, New York City schools. It could be cyberbullying of that neighbor, but not in, maybe that student goes to a private school and not New York City Department of Education school. If that, again, doesn't impact the city school environment, it would not be considered cyberbullying for purposes of the definition. And it's really important, I think, for us to recognize how much happens on social media and electronically, and just generally to be aware that, especially with the pandemic and so much that's happening with loss and grieving, there's a lot of anxiety, anger, emotions, fear, isolation, stress, depression, and trauma that our young people are facing. You may know that there is a youth mental health crisis. We actually testified yesterday in front of the city council about the need for more and more supports for students and for schools to be able to support students. And so these emotions can have real potential to cause an increase in cyberbullying behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what we can do about all of this. So on the next slide, how do we recognize bullying? So getting a little bit deeper into what we started talking about before is there are certain characteristics of bullying. Power difference is certainly one of them, and it could be actual or intent. It could be actual intent to cause harm, or actual harm, or it could be an intention to cause harm, and it can look repetitious. And it is most likely to occur towards those certain commonly targeted groups. And we're going to talk about that, and also where there is a low adult presence. So it's important to pay attention to, for example, online space where there may not be a lot of adults. And so sometimes you may observe an interaction between young people and something might seem off, but you aren't sure, or you might sense a change in a young person's behavior and think bullying is happening, but you aren't sure. What we do know is that these are some of the characteristics to look out for. And so, and we're going to get into also that bullying is really most likely to occur based on certain targeted groups. And on the next slide, we have a list of those targeted groups, and which can be more likely where students, if they are a member in those groups, then they may experience more bullying and be targeted. It's called bias-based bullying, based on race, color, creed, ethnicity, national origin, citizenship, immigration status, religion, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, disability, or weight. And just because a student is bullied and they are, for example, they have a disability, it doesn't mean that it is bias-based bullying. It is if the bullying is because of that identity, because of their disability. For example, if a student has a physical limitation where they're in a wheelchair or using crutches, and then the student is being shamed for not being able to walk, that would clearly be bias-based bullying based on the disability. But let's say that same student is being harassed for and the student, doesn't have a disability related to the characteristic that they're being bullied for. If they're not being included in a group with others, it may not be because of that particular characteristic. So laws and regulations that govern New York City public schools provide that students can be bullied for any reason. And then for all of these specific characteristics, there is also language in the law saying that students cannot be bullied based on their identity, their membership in any of these groups. And so something to note is that the intent of the law is to protect young people from bullying on their identity. And this includes some identities that aren't protected in other settings, but are protected here. So one really important point is that the membership in this group can be, any of these groups can be actual or perceived. What that means is that even if the student isn't part of the specific protected group, if the person engaging in bullying believes that the person is in that targeted group, then that could be considered bias-based bullying. So, for example, if a student is perceived to have be of a different gender identity, but that they don't see themselves that way, and the student is being bullied, and the person engaging in bullying believes that person has that other identity and is bullying because of that, then that would be considered bias-based bullying. So we're going to pause for a second or to see if there are any questions. Liliana is going to read any questions and answers out loud if there are any at the moment, and there will be many other opportunities to ask questions, and where there's a whole host of material that we haven't gotten to yet. So just want to pause for a second.
There are no open questions at this time. I think you can continue, but everyone should feel welcome if they have questions to enter them into the Q&A, and I'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. Thanks, Dawn.
Thank you so much, Liliana. So now we're going to talk about how are students protected from bullying. And so, as I had mentioned earlier, there is a law, Dignity for All Students Act, and a New York City Chancellor's regulation. Essentially, students have the right to a safe learning environment. Students should not be afraid to go to school. And there can be no bullying, harassment, or discrimination based on actual or perceived characteristics that we talked about. And that includes weight, someone's weight. I think people think of the other characteristics a lot. They may not think of weight as well too. That is under the law protected. Also, school districts must report bullying incidents at the end of every year to the New York State Education Department. So there are data reporting laws. And in addition, there is also a New York State human rights law that protects students from bullying. So, and the Chancellor's regulation that I'm mentioning, I will point out later where you can find it, and it is in 10 languages on the Department of Education website. So we're going to now turn to what must schools do when bullying occurs. The law also requires that every year, every school is supposed to have a plan to prevent and address harassment, intimidation, and bullying. They're supposed to publicize information about, this is the school district and schools share information about what's called respect for all, is the term that's used with students and parents annually. They're supposed to share information about how to file complaints, how to get support, how to prevent bullying, and make the Chancellor's regulation A832 available to parents, and also train respect for all RFA liaisons. At every school has an RFA respect for all liaison who also has a full-time job as an educator. So that person is really taking on an extra role, and they are supposed to help train all students and staff on bullying policies by October 31st every year. And there is the law, of course, that requires reporting, investigating, and stopping bullying. So we are going to turn to the next slide and go into a little bit more about what schools must do. So the Respect for All liaison is, like I said, a school staff member who is trained, has special training themselves, and then provides training on bullying, discrimination, and harassment issues, and reporting, investigation, and responses. Each school must have a Respect for All liaison. It can be someone with other responsibilities, and it typically is. For example, parent coordinator, could be an assistant principal, could be a teacher. And the goal of that position is to prevent bullying, harassment, and discrimination in schools, not just to educate on reporting but to talk about how to prevent it is really key. And so in order to find the Respect for All liaison contact information, you can turn to the next slide, and you will see on the web page, if you go to the New York City Department of Education website and you go to your child's school web page, and then you will be able to see there should be the name of the liaison listed on the school website. We also have there are also additional resources, lots of resources on the Department of Education, and we're going to keep coming back to this again and again, is that the Department of Education really has a great website right now, which is pretty much a one-stop shop with all the resources on what's called Respect for All, in terms of information, how to get support, but also how to report and report bullying, and also the chancellor's regulations, and everything's on there. So now we're going to turn to the next slide and just do a quick check-in to see if there are any questions so far. And we're going to keep going. So how to report bullying. School staff must report bullying. It must be orally reported to the principal or the Respect for All liaison within 1 day of learning about the bullying, or at this point, it's really potentially bullying because we don't fully know if it's bullying yet, right? We talked about it really needs to be investigated, but if there are signs that there might be bullying, then school staff need to report it, and also file a written report within 2 days. So, and I think it's important to really think about, how to that it might be bullying, and talking about it in that sense, and ask for an investigation. And any person can report bullying to school. It could be anyone in the school, it could be a parent, it could be a student. And there are so many different ways to do so. On your screen, you can see there's an email address, that Respect for All email address. And if you go to that email address, you can put in the information in any language, submit a complaint online. There is the actual link that you can see. I tried to put the link in different formats to make it accessible to everybody, so you could actually see the URL, but then also it is in words at the bottom of the screen as well. New York City DOE Respect for All webpage with FAQs, frequently asked questions. There is a list of frequently asked questions on that website. There's also a complaint form we have on the slide there, the phone number that could be used if that's the preferential way of reporting. If the issue involves sexual or gender harassment, gender-based harassment, Something newer is that the Department of Education has a Title IX coordinator and coordinators, which is something that is to keep in mind. So there, and you can report bullying in multiple ways to get it to the attention of different people. So in the next slide, we're also going to talk about how to report bullying by school staff. On the next slide, we're talking about actions by school staff towards students and families that can also be considered bullying, harassment, or discrimination. And that does happen sometimes. We see in our work that young people coming back from, for example, court-involved youth settings when they've been in juvenile detention, sometimes are stigmatized when they're coming back in to school. I've worked with families where that's been the case, and they feel that it's not a welcoming environment, but most schools are incredibly welcoming environments, and we know that educators are incredibly hardworking, and we work with wonderful educators all the time. My parents are actually both educators. And to report bullying, harassment, or discrimination by school staff, if it isn't the principal doing the alleged bullying, harassment, or discrimination, you can tell the principal or email Respect for All. You can also contact, there is an Office of Special Investigations, OSI, and there's a phone number on the screen as well as a link to file a report. And if the discrimination against parents is based on race, color, ethnicity, national origin, immigration status, or religion, you can also contact the DOE's Office of Equal Opportunity and Diversity Management's Complaint Unit, and there's a phone number on the screen there too. And on the next slide, some tips for reporting bullying is really report in writing with proof of the date sent, so that you can use an email or online form so that there is there's a documentation, and it should include details of what happened, who it happened to, when, where, and how the incident happened. And the other thing to note is that the Chancellor's regulation protects people who report bullying. It protects them from retaliation. So now we're going to turn to how is bullying investigated. Once a complaint is made, it must be entered into the school's database, and it's called an Online Occurrence Reporting System, or ORS, within 24 hours of receiving the oral report. And the principal must investigate the complaint within 5 days of that oral report. Now we're going to turn to how is bullying investigated. So it should be investigated through interviewing the target of bullying, and that happens with requesting written statements, oral conversations describing the behavior, location, time, and witnesses. And of course, the conversation is documented. And then the accused student is also interviewed and advised to stop the behavior if it did occur. And that conversation must be documented. There's a request for a written statement from the student accused of bullying. And of course, there are also, if there are any witnesses, they will be interviewed as well. And those conversations are documented, and a request for written statements is also made. And turning to the next slide, to continue along this, at the beginning of the investigation, either the principal or the Respect for All liaison must contact the parents of all students involved to discuss the allegations, except where contacting the parents would be a safety issue for the student. At the end of the investigation, the principal or the liaison must report the results of the investigation to the parents of all students involved. And how is bullying determined? Turning to the next slide, it is determined based on any decision about, what is considered bullying. It is really based on the totality of the circumstances. And so it is looking at everything on the screen there, from ages of the persons involved, the nature and severity of the behavior, frequency and duration of the behavior, number of the persons involved, context of the incidents, where the incidents occurred, and the history of whether there are similar incidents that occurred. So I'm going to turn to the next slide, and I think we can keep going.
There's one question. Sorry, I was just.
Okay, let's pause for that question. Shall we continue?
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
All right, here it goes.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
we can hear you now.
Perfect. Sorry about that. It says,
No problem.
Can you explain more about whether the legal definition of bullying requires a quote unquote power imbalance between the aggressor and victim? For example, the target being annoyed by the aggressor, but not scared of the aggressor. Does that still count as bullying?
So it all goes back to that original definition of if the behavior substantially interferes with the student's mental, emotional, and physical well-being, or it's reasonably expected to cause some kind of harm, or in this case, if does it substantially interfere with the student's learning, reasonably cause fear for safety. Generally, there is a power imbalance, and it may not be apparent, I think, but that is not part of the legal definition. So technically, that is not required. So we're going to continue on, and how should schools respond to bullying? And the key is that they must stop the behavior. They must stop the behavior. And I know this can be challenging. And if schools need help, they should reach out to the superintendent's office for more resources. And, it is key to that, retaliation is not supposed to happen against anyone involved. And if it does, then that should be reported. And schools should be recommending supports and interventions for everyone involved. The student who is being bullied, as well as the student who is accused of bullying, could be individual counseling, positive behavioral supports, education services, something called collaborative problem solving. And also restorative practices could be used, although the Department of Education really shies away from it, and for good reason. It has to be done with consent from both parties, and the accused student may or may not want to engage, and same with the student being bullied. And it could be in a form of conflict resolution or mediation, and really the person who would be doing that has to be particularly skilled in how to do it in a bullying situation. The other thing is that progressive discipline is part of the discipline code, and if there is bullying that is determined, then there could be, there are lots of different supports and interventions listed on the discipline code, as well as other consequences, and it depends on what happened before. There could be a suspension, but doesn't necessarily need to be a suspension. And from research shows that suspension does not change student behavior. It's not effective, and it actually could, and we have seen it lead to more bullying afterwards. So we are very, we find the most effective ways are to really address the root cause and provide supports for everybody. So now we're going to turn to what if the school does not respond or the bullying continues. On the next slide, we have resources for filing a complaint with the DOE. These are the same ones that repeated. I've been talking about. There is also escalation assistance on the DOE website. That same webpage, New York City DOE Respect for All. Contacting the superintendent's office is also a good idea. And the other thing is you can file a complaint with. You can also file a complaint with the New York City Department of Human Rights. There's a complaint form and hotline on the screen. And also, you can file a complaint with the United States Department of Office of Civil Rights. Now that has to be filed within 180 days of the incident, and it must be based on one of the protected categories. And there is a complaint form on the webpage too. You will get a copy of all these slides, and they will be put up on our website as well. So you will get all this material. So turning to the next slide, how can parents work with the school? The best thing to do is really to create or request a safety plan, an individual support plan. Particularly for the student who to address the bullying, whether the student is experiencing the bullying or engaging in the bullying. This can be really, really helpful. Can ask to change seat, schedule, program, lunch, dismissal time, request counseling for students, notify staff of bullying history, restorative practices potentially, suggest staff or student trainings, designate a certain staff member or staff members for the student in the school to be a support or for the student. Ask staff to keep a lookout for conflict in the school. And it's best to get this in writing, to have a document that everyone can turn to. I mean, it's really important to include the young person in this process. They will know themselves what is probably best for them. So turning to the next slide, responses to cyberbullying. Some of the things that we recommend are, and this is teachings that schools teach all students about digital citizenship so that they know how and understand the importance of responsible online behavior. And also asking the school to provide students with some social emotional supports. And again, requesting restorative practices to help address conflict, not necessarily even bullying, but conflict, because restorative practices are practices that focus on building relationships. And so the more you have relationships, and there's a lot of research showing that, and these connections, that there's less likely to be bullying. There's less likely, because then you know each other. And so it's a really, it takes all different forms from circles to informal practices, advisories. We're going to turn now to who should I reach out to in the DOE. And again, you can start with the school, parent coordinator, social worker, school counselor, principal, school-based support team. If that doesn't address the needs that you're, in terms of stopping bullying or getting supports, go to the district superintendent's office, and there are family support coordinators, a family support coordinator there at each office, student services manager, special education manager, restorative justice director. There should be a behavior expert. And if there are special education issues involved, you can contact the central office of special education. All this information is, again, it's on the webpage. And the slide that we're talking about now. So turning to the next slide, we are going to talk about other options. It looks like unfortunately, we started a few minutes late, so I'm going to kind of go through a little bit more quickly so we can get through everything. Although the student has a right to stay in school, they do not have to transfer the student, any of the students. But there are other options. There are safety transfers. It can be difficult to get, but unless there is a real safety issue, and then it's not difficult. So providing details, getting as many documents as you can, and guidance transfer if a student isn't making progress academically or socially, a transfer might be helpful. This parent has to request it. School cannot force the student out with a guidance transfer, and superintendent must approve it. And there are also other transfers. The Chancellor's Regulation A101 includes all this information, and it's on the DOE website. So we're going to talk about special considerations for students with disabilities. Bullying can really impact the child's academic, social, emotional, or behavioral functioning. And if the student is engaging in or experiencing bullying, either way, highly encourage a parent to request an IEP meeting to address the bullying behavior, discuss the concern at an IEP meeting. IEP should include a plan to prevent and address bullying, account for the behavior of other students if that's necessary, not in the sense of essentially making sure that the student is safe, and that is supported. So other considerations are requesting a functional behavioral assessment to develop a behavior intervention plan, and we're going to get to that in a second. IEP goals that account for bullying behavior. For example, that could include a child will raise her hand before walking out of her seat. Child will request to sit next to another child at lunch, or will use a color system to report her mood. Also, supplementary aids could be requested, like speech language therapy, counseling, assistive technology. Sometimes bullying behavior is a way that a student is struggling academically or emotionally, tries to signal that they are having an issue with their placement. So it's important to get to the root of the issue. And so turning to the next slide, a functional behavioral assessment does that. It looks at why does the behavior occur? What behavior needs to change? And then when does the behavior occur? Where, how often, for how long? And then that FBA, turn to the next slide, is what goes into the creating the behavior intervention plan, classroom observations, reports, interviews. And the behavior intervention plan should be created with the parent and the student. Prevent behavior from occurring, manage the behavior, measure progress. And we have lots of materials, guides, and fact sheets that go into FBAs, BIPs, for example, in more detail, as well as on the next slide, students with disabilities also have discipline rights, even if the alleged behavior is considered bullying. And so they may be entitled to a manifestation determination to review to determine if the student cannot be suspended from school for behavior that is a manifestation of the student's disability. And so you can see our AFC has a guide on MDRs on our website. And finally, I want to talk about social emotional behavioral support. So let's turn to that next. And we're going to talk about some school-based supports. On the next slide, we have at-risk counseling, for example, can be requested. And usually that's about 8 to 12 weeks. And we're not talking about mandated counseling on an IEP or 504 plan. These are on this page. This is available to all students and can be requested. And it could be with a school social worker, a guidance counselor, a psychologist. Informal behavior interventions are also for a limited time. It could be a behavior contract or chart, or attendance monitoring, some kind of points or reward system. It could be a signal to take a break, and maybe a check-in at the beginning or end of the school day. Also, every school is required to have a crisis de-escalation plan under Chancellor's Regulation A411. Each school must develop this plan with strategies to de-escalate behaviors safely, identify locations in the schools where students in crisis need to be safely isolated and de-escalated. And there are also, every school also has, and students should have access to school-based mental health services. And we're going to turn to shortly some ways to find them. But also schools have, for STH is Students in Temporary Housing, Community Coordinators, and Single Shepherd. There are other supports for students who are in temporary housing or in foster care, for example. But if you turn to the next slide, there are a host of school-based mental health services. DOE has a webpage that lists various ones, and you can see on here, there are clinicians, there are school response teams, there are mental health programs. Some schools have hospital based hospital mental health clinics or partnerships. Some schools have their own health clinics or mental health clinics. And in order to see what your school has, you can turn to the next page. And we're really excited that the DOE has started putting on school web pages. If you go to the DOE webpage for your school, you can find the school. And then on the next slide, once you find the school, for example, here, Jill Chaffetz Transfer High School, you scroll down and you'll see there's a mental health and wellness tab. And if you turn to the next page, it goes in further and it shows you what the school actually has. And so in Jill Chaffetz, for example, there is a school-based mental health clinic and there's a phone number you can call. There's also a community school phone number. And then there may not be this specific information for every single school, but there is a list of resources. And if there isn't specific information, you can ask to speak with the school social worker, counselor to find out what supports are at the school. So turning to the next slide, and we really went through some of this before, is that the Department of Education embraces progressive discipline, and every school should be implementing that. So what that means is that overly punitive methods of discipline are not in the best interests of students. And this is not just the New York City Department of Education. The state has embraced this and it's in the state's plan. And we know that students are better served by providing positive supports that to teach students social, emotional, and behavioral skills. And that to provide enhanced support to students with special needs or those who are suffering from trauma due to exposure to poverty or violence. And the DOE's mission also includes reducing the use of suspensions as a disciplinary tool. So definitely use the discipline code as a resource. And if you turn to the next slide, we are up to restorative justice, which we actually talked about a little bit before. And it can improve a student's behavior and academics. It also can lower the incidence of repeated misbehavior. So if you turn a couple of slides later, we're going to talk a little bit about, there are various behavior management tools you can request and you can use it at home as well. A visual daily schedule, mental breaks between tasks, movement breaks, verbal and visual cues for directions and staying on task, behavior chart or contract, consistent use of positive reinforcement, daily teacher feedback to student and parent. And on the next slide, this is just a recap of how should schools respond to bullying, stopping it, prohibiting retaliation, recommending, providing supports and interventions for everyone involved, using restorative practices as a preventive tool, not necessarily with bullying, but as a preventive tool and with conflict resolution when there isn't bullying, but conflict, and when both parties consent, using progressive discipline if the behavior violated discipline code, And again, that doesn't necessarily mean removing the student from the classroom. So it has been an absolute pleasure being here with you today. And on the next slide, we have lots of resources for you that you will have access to. And also on the final slide, we would love to hear from you if you have questions. I will be staying, Liliana and I will be staying a little bit after this webinar. If anyone has specific questions you want to ask, we can do our best after. If they are more directed toward and confidential or private, please feel free to contact our helpline, 866-427-6033. And or you can email us, and please complete our survey form. And again, it's been a pleasure being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Liliana.
Hi, I am going to try to stop the recording. 1 second.